She'd been reading to the blind old woman for 11 days straight. Same routine, same chair, same cup of Earl Grey cooling on the side table, when Colette finally noticed something that made her fingers stop mid-sentence. Page 214, a faint pencil line beneath a single word. She almost missed it. Almost. But then page 218 had one too. And page 223. Her throat tightened. Mrs. Salvetti couldn't see she'd been completely blind for 5 years. She couldn't have underlined anything, and yet someone had marked these pages deliberately, carefully, as if hiding something in plain sight inside a book no one would ever think to check. Colette glanced up slowly. The old woman sat perfectly still in her armchair, her silver hair pinned back, her posture straight as a blade, her clouded eyes fixed on nothing, but her hands were gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles had gone white. And then, without turning her head, Mrs. Salvetti whispered something that sent a chill straight through Colette's chest. "Keep reading, dear. Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't ever stop." Colette didn't understand it, then not the words, not the fear buried inside them, not the reason a blind woman who hadn't left that room in 3 years was shaking like someone who'd just heard footsteps outside her door. But she would, because every single page Colette had been reading out loud wasn't literature. It was a code, a desperate, silent warning stitched into chapters and paragraphs by a mother who couldn't speak the truth out loud because someone inside her own family's mansion was listening to every word she said. And the last person who'd sat in Colette's chair, who had become the silent hands for the old woman's hidden messages, eventually leaving her own marks of discovery between those lines. That woman hadn't quit her job 5 weeks ago. She'd disappeared, and no one had asked why. If this story grabs you, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to where it all started 6 weeks before Colette ever set foot inside that house. 6 weeks before Colette Varden stepped into that house, she woke at 5 o'clock in the morning in the 4th-floor studio apartment, with no elevator, in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where the walls cracked along the old water pipes, and the streetlight outside slipped through the thin curtains, falling across the peeling wooden floor. Bea lay curled beside her on the single bed the two sisters had shared for the past 3 years, her oversized nightgown slipping down one shoulder and revealing the long scar running down the center of the little girl's chest, pale and fine as a thread of silver, the mark left by the heart surgery 2 years earlier at Mount Sinai Hospital, the surgery that had saved Bea's life, and, at the same time, buried Colette beneath a $47,000 debt she didn't know when she would ever be able to repay. Colette sat up carefully, trying not to wake her sister. She reached for the stack of letters on the kitchen table, the ones she had avoided opening for 2 days, then tore open the envelope on top. The notice was from Mount Sinai's financial office, the bold print sitting right in the middle of the page, the overdue amount, the warning that the account would be turned over to a collection agency if payment wasn't made within 30 days. She set the letter down, face down against the table, as though not seeing it would make it disappear. 4 months earlier, Colette had still been a 3rd-grade teacher at a public school in East New York. She wasn't brilliant, but she was patient, and the children liked her because she read to them in a voice that made every character come alive. Then the budget was cut, her contract wasn't renewed, and she left the school with a cardboard box of personal belongings and a good luck card from colleagues, none of whom called her afterward. Since that day, she had applied everywhere, waitressing in Williamsburg, working the night shift as a cashier at a convenience store on Myrtle Avenue, babysitting for 2 families in Park Slope. None of the jobs paid enough. None of them offered enough hours. And every month, the debt swelled further because of interest she didn't even dare to calculate. She began skipping breakfast, so Bea would have enough milk for school. Then she skipped lunch, too. Then she slowly grew used to hunger until it became part of the day, like brushing her teeth or locking the door. That afternoon, Colette took Bea to the Brooklyn Public Library on Flatbush Avenue because the studio was too hot, and at least here there was free air conditioning. Bea sat in the comic book corner, while Colette scanned the job board pinned to the wall near the front desk. Most of it was familiar: hourly cleaning, delivery work, pet care. Then she saw it. A small white sheet of paper, with no logo, pinned in the lower right corner, almost hidden beneath the yoga class flyer above it. The print was simple, without ornament: hiring a full-time caregiver, reading books to a visually impaired elderly person, room and board included. Salary $5,000 a month. No company name, no address, Only a phone number. Colette read it 3 times. $5,000 a month. 3 times any job she had seen in the past 4 months. Room and board included meant saving rent money. Reading books was the one thing she knew she did well. Everything was too perfect, and Colette had lived long enough to know that things that were too perfect always came with a price no one mentioned up front. But then she looked over at Bea, who was smiling with a comic book in her hands, the scar on her chest hidden beneath her shirt, and Colette took out her phone and called. The interview took place 3 days later, at a law office on Park Avenue, on the 23rd floor. The kind of office with marble floors and a receptionist in a suit. No one told her which family was hiring. No one told her where the house was. They only ran a background check, asked about her experience reading to visually impaired people, and asked her to read aloud from a book they had already placed on the table. She read. The room fell silent. The man sitting at the end of the table, whom she didn't yet know was named Whelan, looked at her once and said, in a voice that carried no emotion at all, that she would start on Monday. Colette stepped out of the building on Park Avenue with the signed contract in her hand and a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was like standing before a closed door that someone had just opened for her. But behind that door was darkness, and she had no flashlight, only desperation, and an 8-year-old sister who needed her so badly that Colette was willing to step into anything. On Monday morning, a glossy black car pulled up in front of the studio apartment in Bushwick at exactly 7 o'clock. Colette had been awake since 5, folding clothes into the only suitcase she owned, a fabric suitcase with crooked wheels that she had bought at a thrift store on Knickerbocker Avenue. Bea stood in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear with the worn ears, her eyes red but not crying because Colette had told her that her sister was going away for work for a few days and would bring her to visit on the weekend, that Mrs. Jenkins downstairs would take her to school, that everything would be all right. Colette kissed her sister's forehead, feeling the thin scar beneath the cloth of Bea's shirt as the little girl pressed against her chest, then stepped into the car without looking back, because she knew that if she looked back, she wouldn't be able to leave. The driver didn't say a word the entire way. The car crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, cut through Manhattan, then headed north along the highway beside the Hudson River. The city thinned outside the window, shifting from concrete to green trees, from car horns to silence. A little more than an hour later, the car turned onto a narrow road that ran through a dense oak forest, the kind of road that wasn't on Google Maps, though Colette had tried to find it the night before. Then she saw it. The black iron gate stood almost 4 meters high, with no nameplate, flanked by 2 gray stone pillars covered in moss. The gate opened automatically, as the car approached and closed again immediately behind them. The sound of metal striking metal like the snap of a lock sliding into place. The white gravel drive curved between 2 rows of maple trees, then opened onto a mansion Colette had only ever seen in movies. Gray stone, dark brown roof tiles, 3 stories, tall arched windows, ivy crawling over the entire eastern wall. It was beautiful in the way old and expensive things were often beautiful. Not welcoming, not warm, simply existing there with the confidence of something that didn't need anyone's admiration. Colette stepped out of the car, her suitcase dragging unevenly over the white gravel, and for the first time, she felt that the distance between Bushwick and this place wasn't an hour's drive, but an entire world. The person who received her at the front door was a woman in her late 50s, brown hair pinned into a tight bun, white shirt buttoned to the throat, back straight, eyes sharp and cold as the marble beneath Colette's feet. Dolores Fenn, the head housekeeper. She shook Colette's hand with just enough politeness, not 1 second more than necessary, then turned and walked ahead. Colette followed her through a grand foyer with a ceiling 3 times higher than her studio apartment, down a corridor floored in dark oak and lined with oil paintings that Colette didn't dare look at too closely, then stopped before a wooden door leading into the east wing of the mansion. Dolores turned back to look at her and began speaking in a flat voice, like someone reciting rules she had long since memorized. Colette would stay in the east wing. Her room was at the end of the second-floor hallway. The west wing was private, and she was not to enter it for any reason. She was not to leave her room after 9 o'clock at night. She was not to ask about the family, about their work, or about anything that didn't directly concern her duties. And she was absolutely not to use her phone in Madame Constance's room. Colette nodded after every sentence and didn't ask why, because instinctively she understood that this was not the kind of place where people asked why. Dolores led her to Constance's room at the end of the east wing on the first floor. The room was larger than Colette's entire studio apartment, with heavy velvet curtains drawn open just enough to let afternoon light fall in a narrow strip across the wooden floor. The air smelled of tea, old paper, and something lighter that Colette would only later recognize as the scent of dried lavender that Constance kept hidden in a cloth pouch beneath her pillow. The old woman sat in an armchair beside the open window, her back perfectly straight, as though someone had taught her how to sit from the moment she learned to walk, and she had never forgotten. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, not one strand out of place. Her hands rested on the thick book lying in her lap, the fingers long and thin but not trembling. Her eyes were open, facing straight toward the window, but they saw nothing at all, both pupils covered with a cloudy film like mist on glass. Dolores spoke, her voice a little softer than it had been when she spoke to Colette. "Madam, the new caregiver has arrived." Constance didn't turn her head. She was silent long enough that Colette thought she hadn't heard. Then she spoke, her voice low and clear in every syllable. "New footsteps. Lighter than the last ones. Younger." Colette blinked. The woman could tell the difference by footsteps alone. "I'm Colette Varden, madam." Silence stretched again. Dolores stood behind her, not interfering, only watching. Then Constance tilted her head slightly, only a few degrees, as though listening to something no one else in the room could hear. "Do you know what it means to read books for the blind, Miss Varden?" Colette hesitated. "Yes, madam. It means reading aloud." Constance didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth shifted upward, thin and sharp. "No. It means you become their eyes. You bring them what they can no longer touch for themselves." She turned her face toward Colette, her blind eyes finding the exact place where the young woman stood with a precision that made Colette shiver. "My question is, what will you show me?" Colette stood there, in the dim room faintly scented with lavender, before a blind old woman she had met less than 2 minutes ago. And for the first time since signing the contract on Park Avenue, she didn't think about money, didn't think about the debt, didn't think about B. She only thought that this woman, though she couldn't see anything at all, was seeing her more clearly than anyone Colette had ever met. The first days passed in a repeating rhythm that Colette memorized faster than she had expected. Wake at 6 o'clock in the morning, wash up, dress neatly but not too formally, because Dolores had reminded her on the second day that Madame Constance didn't like the sound of stiff new fabric or the smell of perfume. At 7 o'clock, go down to the kitchen for the tea tray. Earl Grey steeped for exactly 3.5 minutes. No sugar. One thin slice of lemon placed beside the cup but not dropped in, because Constance wanted to decide for herself whether she would use lemon that day. At 7:30, enter Constance's room. Set the tea tray on the side table. Sit in the old velvet-covered wooden chair, placed exactly 4 steps from the old woman's armchair. Then begin reading. 4 hours each day, divided into 2 sessions, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. But what Colette couldn't get used to was the way Constance chose books. She never said to continue from where they had left off yesterday. Instead, every morning, she would sit still for a while, then say the title of the book and the exact page number, as though she had planned it the night before, in the darkness of eyes that could no longer see anything. Monday was Hemingway, but only chapter 12 of A Farewell to Arms. Nothing before it, nothing after it. Tuesday jumped to Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, beginning in the middle of chapter 7. Wednesday returned to Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, page 312, reading exactly 15 pages, and then stopping. Colette asked once, gently, why they didn't read from the beginning of the book. Constance was silent long enough that Colette thought she wouldn't bother answering. Then the old woman said, her voice flat and calm, "Because I don't need to hear the entire story. I only need to hear the part I need to hear." Colette never asked again. She read exactly what the old woman requested, though at times she felt as if she were piecing together a painting without being allowed to see the original image. Between the reading hours, the mansion was so quiet that Colette could hear the wood expanding inside the walls when the afternoon sun fell across them. She saw no one except Dolores and the 2 kitchen maids, whom she only glimpsed in passing in the hallway each morning. The west wing of the mansion was always closed, and sometimes at night she heard cars pulling up outside, doors closing, heavy footsteps on the gravel, but she never saw anyone. She didn't ask. She remembered the rules. Dolores appeared with no schedule Colette could predict. Some mornings, the woman was standing right outside Constance's door when Colette came out, as though she had been standing there for the entire 2 hours. Some afternoons, she entered Colette's room without knocking, saying she needed to check whether the sheets had to be changed, then stayed just long enough for her eyes to sweep over the desk, the notebook, the phone charging there. Colette didn't object, because she had lived long enough in a world where other people had more power than she did to know that objecting only made them pay closer attention. On the 5th day, Dolores stopped her in the hallway after the afternoon reading. She stood blocking the path, hands clasped in front of her stomach, and looked at Colette with an expression the young woman couldn't read as concern or warning. "You're doing well. Madame Constance seems to like your reading voice." "Thank you, Mrs. Fenn." Dolores gave a slight nod, then added, her voice unchanged, though its pace slowed just enough for every word to carry weight. "The woman before you, Nina Calloway, did well too. She was very good, until she began getting too curious." Colette kept her face calm, though her chest tightened. "What happened to her?" Dolores looked at her for another beat. She resigned. Then she turned and walked away, her heels striking evenly against the wooden floor, never looking back. Colette stood alone in the hallway, afternoon light slipping through the window at the far end and laying a long amber streak across the floor, and she realized that over the past 5 days, what unsettled her most about this house wasn't the darkness, wasn't the rules, wasn't Dolores's coldness, or Constance's blind eyes seeing straight through her. The most frightening thing was the silence, the kind of silence so dense that she felt it was hiding something, like the smooth surface of a lake when everyone knew there was a current underneath, but no one said so. And Colette began to understand that in this house, not speaking was the primary language. On the 9th night, Colette woke at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning because of a thirst burning in her throat that she couldn't ignore. She lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling in the dark, weighing the choice between enduring the thirst until morning and breaking the rule that said she wasn't allowed to leave her room after 9 o'clock at night. Thirst won. She sat up, didn't turn on the light, stepped barefoot onto the cold wooden floor, opened her bedroom door as quietly as she could, and walked down the east wing hallway toward the kitchen. The mansion at night was a different world. By day, it was quiet, but there was still light, the distant sound of footsteps, the soft clink of dishes touching in the kitchen. At night, it was deathly still, with only the breathing of the aging house, the crackle of old wood, and the wind slipping through the gap of some window that hadn't been fully closed. Colette walked quickly, keeping close to the wall, and she would have reached the kitchen and returned without anyone knowing if she hadn't taken the wrong turn at the end of the hallway. She realized she had crossed the boundary into the west wing when the wood beneath her feet changed from pale oak to dark walnut. She stopped, about to turn back, when she saw the light. A thin yellow streak slipped through the crack of the large library door at the end of the corridor, the heavy wooden door not quite closed. She should have turned back. She knew that. Every rule Dolores had laid down, every survival instinct Colette had gathered over 27 years of living, told her to turn back. But then she heard the voice, low, even, so cold it didn't need to be loud to carry weight. She stepped closer, only a few steps, just enough to look through the narrow opening. Inside was a library she had never seen before, with walls of bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling, a large wooden table in the center, and a single desk lamp casting a round pool of light across the tabletop, while leaving the rest of the room sunk in shadow. A man sat behind the desk, black suit, no tie, shirt collar open, one hand resting on the table beside a glass of amber whiskey. His face rested on the border between light and dark, one half revealing sharply cut features, a square jaw, dark eyes, the other half swallowed by shadow. He wasn't old, perhaps a little over 35, but the stillness he carried belonged to the kind of man who had lived more than his years. In front of him, about an arm's length from the desk, another man was kneeling, not kneeling to beg, not kneeling because he had been beaten, but kneeling in the way a body understood on its own that standing wasn't an option in that room. His head was bowed, his hands hanging at his sides, his shoulders trembling faintly, though not a sound came from him. The man behind the desk said something, too softly for Colette to hear clearly, only a short sentence, in the kind of voice someone might use to order dinner in a restaurant. Then he gave a slight nod. Whelan, whom Colette recognized at once from the massed, straight posture and broad shoulders she had seen during the interview on Park Avenue, stepped forward from a dark corner, pulled the kneeling man to his feet, and led him away through a side door. No scream, no blood, no violence the eye could see. But what Colette had just witnessed was more frightening than violence, because violence could still be resisted, while the absolute submission that man had shown before the one seated behind the desk could not. It didn't come from momentary fear. It came from something deeper, older, something built over many years and something no one dared to question. Colette stepped back. Her bare heel struck the leg of a small table set in the hallway. The table that held a vase of flowers by day and became a trap for those who wandered where they didn't belong by night. The sound of wood hitting wood rang through the dark hallway like a gunshot. Everything froze. Then the voice rose from inside, the same low, even voice she had just heard, but this time aimed straight at her. "Come out." 2 words. Not loud, not repeated, not necessary. Colette stood still for 1 heartbeat, then stepped through the partly open door into the library. She stood before him in the old sleepwear she had brought from Bushwick, the soft, loose t-shirt and long cotton pants, wearing the thin slippers she had brought from Bushwick on the cold walnut floor, hair falling over her shoulders, hands clenched at her sides because she didn't know where to put them, and she wouldn't let him see them shake. The man looked at her, in no hurry, not angry, his gaze moving from her bare feet up to her face with the precision of someone used to judging everything in a matter of seconds. "Who?" His voice wasn't a question but an order to answer. "Colette Varden, Madame Constance caregiver." Silence. He tilted his head slightly to one side, a small but calculated gesture, like a predator tilting its head before deciding whether the prey was worth chasing. "Were you getting water, or were you listening?" "I was getting water." She answered at once, without hesitation, without looking down, without adding apologies or long explanations. Her voice was calm, not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. So afraid she could feel the pulse beating at her temples. But she had lived with fear long enough to know that trembling in front of powerful people only gave them more power. He looked at her for several more seconds, long enough for her to feel as if his gaze were peeling her apart layer by layer, and she looked back, not defiant, not arrogant, simply refusing to lower her head. "Go back to your room." He said it, his voice easing just enough to make the words permission rather than dismissal. "Don't let me see you here again." Colette turned and walked out, steady, not running. She went down the west wing hallway, crossed the boundary back into the east wing, entered her room, closed the door, leaned her back against the wood, and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. Her hands were shaking now, shaking hard, both of them, and she wrapped her arms around her knees and waited for the trembling to pass. She knew she had just seen something not meant for her, and she knew that man, the true master of this house, Constance's son, had seen her seeing him. But what she didn't know was that after she walked out, Cassian Salvetti remained in the library for a very long time, his whiskey untouched, his eyes fixed on the crack of the door where she had just stood, and for the first time in many years, he felt unsettled, not because someone had seen him, but because that someone had looked straight into his eyes and hadn't lowered her head. The next morning, Colette entered Constance's room with the tea tray as she did every day, trying to keep the rhythm of her steps normal, though the night before still clung to her skin like a layer of cold sweat that hadn't dried. She set the tray down, sat in the chair, and opened the book Constance had requested the day before. She hadn't even managed to read the first sentence when Constance spoke, her voice as flat as still water but as precise as a blade. "You met my son last night." Colette's hand stopped on the page. It wasn't a question. The old woman said it as a fact already confirmed, and Colette didn't understand how she knew, because she couldn't see, and her room was at the end of the east wing, almost half the mansion away from the library in the west wing. But then she remembered Constance's ears, the ears that, on the very first day, had known the difference between Colette's footsteps and the footsteps of the woman before her. "Yes, madam." Silence stretched for several breaths. Then Constance tilted her head slightly, that small tilt Colette had begun to recognize as the way the old woman thought. "Good. A person who isn't afraid of my son is either a fool or a liar." She paused. "Which one are you?" Colette hesitated, then answered honestly. "I'm afraid, but I didn't lower my head." Constance said nothing more for a while, but her hand resting on the book loosened, as though that answer had passed a test Colette hadn't known she was taking. Then the old woman said, her voice lighter, "Read. Today I want Dostoevsky, page 312. Colette opened Crime and Punishment to the exact page she had requested and began to read. The passage was about Raskolnikov in his cramped room, haunted by his own crime, the murderer sitting among the people around him while no one recognized what he was. Colette read slowly, clearly, And when she stopped at the end of the passage, Constance said, her voice sounding more like thought spoken aloud than words meant for her, "In Dostoevsky, the murderer is always inside the house, never outside." The sentence hung in the air. Colette stayed silent and didn't ask more, but she felt very clearly that the old woman wasn't talking about the book. She was talking about this house. That afternoon, Constance asked about Bea for the first time. Suddenly, in the middle of Chapter 5 of Gatsby. "Do you have a sibling?" "Yes, madam. A younger sister. Her name is Bea. She's 8 years old. Is she healthy?" "She is now. She had heart surgery 2 years ago. But she's all right now." Constance fell silent. Her hand lifted the teacup but didn't drink from it. Only held it in her palm as if to feel its warmth. "You're raising her alone?" Again, it wasn't a question. "Yes." "How long?" "Since she was 3. My mother died, and my father had already left before then." Constance set the teacup down, slowly, carefully. When she spoke again, her voice carried something Colette hadn't heard in nearly 2 weeks. Not coldness, not control, but grief. The kind of grief so old it was no longer sharp, yet still heavy. "I also have 2 children. I loved them both, but only one of them loved me back." Colette didn't dare ask which child she meant. She only sat still, and in that silence, she felt the connection between them shift. No longer simply caregiver and old woman, but 2 women carrying the weight of the people they loved, one carrying a little sister, the other carrying 2 children when only one had carried her in return. That night, when Colette returned to her room, she sat on the bed with The Great Gatsby, the same book she had read to Constance that morning. She turned back through the pages she had read, not because she wanted to read more, but because something had been gnawing at her from the first days. The way Constance chose books, the way she named specific pages, the strange precision in every request. And there, under the desk lamp, she confirmed what she had glimpsed earlier, page 142, a line underlined in pencil so faint it was almost invisible, thinner than the printed letters themselves. If she hadn't held the book at an angle beneath the lamp, she never would have noticed it. A single word had been underlined, brother. Her heart beat faster. She kept turning. Page 151. Inside, page 163. Watching. She took the copy of Crime and Punishment Constance had asked for that day, opened it to page 312, the exact page where the old woman had told her to begin. Port, page 320, read. Page 337, hook. Her hands began to tremble. She took Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms from the first week, turned the pages, searched, Paxton, then Brennan, then betrayal, then the final 2 words, lying on 2 different pages of 2 different books. But when joined together, they formed a phrase that Colette read again and again, in the dim light of the desk lamp. Father, same. She set all the books down on the bed, lined them up, opened them to the marked pages, and wrote the words on paper in the order Constance had asked her to read over nearly 2 weeks. Brother, inside, watching, port, read, hook, Paxton, Brennan, betrayal, father, same. Colette sat staring at the line of words on the page, her breathing growing shallow, and everything began falling into place with a speed that made her dizzy. Constance was blind. She couldn't have underlined the words herself, but someone had underlined them according to her instructions. The caregiver before Colette, the woman Dolores had said resigned. The woman Colette now understood perhaps had not resigned at all. Paxton was Cassian's younger brother's name. Brennan was a name she had never heard before, but instinct told her it belonged to the other side. Father same. The father was the same. And Colette remembered what Constance had said that afternoon, that she had 2 children and only one loved her back. Then remembered what the old woman had said that morning, that in Dostoevsky, the murderer was always inside the house. Colette folded the paper, slipped it into the pocket of her jacket, turned off the light, lay down in bed in the darkness, and stared up at the ceiling. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a detective. She was an unemployed elementary school teacher from Bushwick, trying to pay off her sister's hospital debt. But she had just realized that the blind old woman she read to every day was trying to send her a message. That there was a traitor inside this very family. That the traitor was perhaps connected to the death of Constance's husband 8 years earlier. And that Colette was now the only person in this house who knew it, aside from an old woman who couldn't say it aloud because someone was listening to every breath she took. On the second weekend, Whelan drove Bea from Brooklyn to the mansion. exactly as stated in the agreement Colette had firmly negotiated from the day she signed the contract on Park Avenue, that she couldn't be away from her sister for more than 5 consecutive days. Colette had been waiting at the main gate since early morning, and when the black car stopped and the rear door opened, Bee jumped down in her old sneakers and the small backpack with the star-shaped keychain Colette had given her for her birthday last year, then threw herself straight into Colette with a long cry of "Letty," stretched out enough to make some of the heaviness Colette had carried all week grow lighter. Bee stared at the mansion with wide, round eyes, turned in a circle on the white gravel, then asked, "Letty, is this a castle?" And Colette laughed. The first real laugh since she had set foot in this house. That afternoon, Colette pushed Constance's wheelchair out into the east garden, as she did every day after the afternoon reading. But today Bee came with them, and the little girl's presence changed everything. Bee didn't know fear the way adults knew fear. She didn't know who this house belonged to, didn't know the rules, didn't know the heavy silence that every wall here held prisoner. She only saw an old woman sitting in a wheelchair in the garden, silver hair gleaming under the late afternoon sun, and she ran to her as naturally as she would have run to her own grandmother. "Hello, ma'am," Bee said, her voice clear and bright in the quiet garden. "I'm Bee." Constance didn't turn her head right away. She sat still, and Colette saw her shoulders draw up slightly, the reaction of someone accustomed to silence being broken by something that wasn't on the schedule. Then the old woman tilted her head toward the voice. "Bee," she repeated the name slowly, as though tasting it. "How old are you?" "8. Your voice sounds like your sister's." Bee laughed. "Everybody says that. Letty says I look more like our mom, but Mom died, so I don't know." Constance was silent for a beat, and Colette saw the old woman's fingers tighten faintly on the arm of the wheelchair, then release. Then Bee asked, with the blunt honesty only children possessed, "Ma'am, why don't your eyes look at Bee?" Colette stepped forward, about to intervene, but Constance had already answered, and her voice then was unlike anything Colette had heard from her in the past 2 weeks. Lighter, softer, as if some outer shell had just cracked. "Because I see with my ears, little one, and my ears can hear that you're smiling." Bee tilted her head, considering that answer with the seriousness of an 8-year-old child, then said, "So you hear really well, huh?" Then she took Constance's hand, as naturally as if there was nothing remarkable about it, and her tiny hand rested inside the old woman's thin palm. Constance didn't pull away. She held the little girl's hand, and Colette saw her lips press together, then loosen, then press together again, as if she were fighting something inside herself that she had locked away for a very long time. Bee began to talk, because Bee always talked, about school, about her friends, about the drawing she had made last week that her teacher had given a high grade. Then she pulled down the collar of her shirt to show the scar on her chest, even though Constance couldn't see it. "Ma'am, I have a scar right here. The doctors fixed my heart. I was really little then, so I don't remember it hurting. But Letty remembers. Letty cried all the time." Colette swallowed hard. She hadn't known Bee remembered that. Constance asked, her voice very soft, "Your sister took care of you then?" "Yes. Letty has taken care of me since I was little. She slept at the hospital with me every night." Silence. Then Constance turned her head toward Colette, her blind eyes aimed exactly at her with a precision that made Colette shiver every time. "You've cared for your sister well." A simple sentence. 6 words. But Colette heard more in it than praise. She heard one mother recognizing another, someone who had sacrificed everything for the child in her hands, and she had to turn her face away for a second, because her eyes stung and she wouldn't cry here. "Not now." Constance laughed. At first, Colette wasn't sure, because that sound was so strange in this house. A small laugh. Soft, slightly hoarse from long disuse, but real. Entirely real. Unguarded, uncontrolled. Bee laughed along because she saw the old woman laughing, and in the east garden of the Salvetti mansion, among the neatly squared hedges of arbor vitae and the flower beds that no one in this house had planted out of love for flowers, 2 bursts of laughter rose at once, one old, one young, and Colette stood between them, not laughing, only holding that moment inside her chest, like something precious she feared would break if she touched it too hard. On the 2nd floor, in the west wing, behind the heavy curtain of his office window, Cassian Salvetti stood watching the garden below. He had no reason to stand at this window on a Saturday afternoon. He had 12 calls unanswered, a meeting with the transportation crew in Red Hook tonight, and a pile of documents on his desk. But he stood there, and he watched. He saw his mother sitting in her wheelchair in the garden, saw a child he had never met holding her hand, saw his mother laugh, and something in his chest, something he had sealed away very carefully many years ago, moved. He saw Colette standing beside her, one hand resting on the back of the wheelchair, bending down to adjust the thin blanket over his mother's lap, the gesture so gentle and natural that it didn't look like the duty of a caregiver, but the habit of someone who truly cared. Then he saw the child pull down her collar, and though he couldn't see clearly from the second floor, he saw enough to know it was a scar. "Whelan," he called without turning around. Whelan stepped forward from behind him, silent and ready as always. The caregiver's background. Cassian had already checked it, had checked it the very night she stood in the library and looked straight into his eyes without lowering her head, but he wanted to hear it again. "Clean," Whelan answered. "Elementary school teacher. East New York Public School. Contract cut 4 months ago. $47,000. In medical debt from Mount Sinai. Heart surgery for her younger sister 2 years ago. Father left. Mother died. Raised the girl alone since the child was 3. No criminal record. No loan shark debt. No ties to any organization." Cassian was silent. Down in the garden, Bea was saying something that made Constance tilt her head to listen, and Colette was smiling, lightly, and he realized this was the first time he had seen her smile. "Keep eyes on her," he said. Whelan nodded, but before turning away, he paused just long enough to recognize something he had served Cassian Salvetti long enough to recognize, that the "keep eyes on her" his boss had just spoken didn't carry the cold tone of a surveillance order. It carried something else. Something Whelan had never heard in Cassian's voice before, and he was wise enough not to comment. It took Colette 2 days after decoding the message to decide. 2 days of reading to Constance as usual, her voice steady while her mind spun with the words on the quarter-folded sheet of paper tucked inside the pocket of the jacket hanging behind her bedroom door. Brother. Inside. Port. Red Hook. Paxton. Brennan. Betrayal. Father same. She wasn't from this world. She taught children how to read letters and tie their shoes. She didn't decode betrayal plots inside a Mafia family. But she also understood that keeping this information to herself meant carrying a bomb in her pocket, and if the wrong person discovered it first, she would end up like the caregiver before her, the woman Dolores said had resigned, but whom Colette now believed had never left this house on her own 2 feet. On Sunday night, after Whelan had taken Bea back to Brooklyn, after Dolores had returned to her room and the mansion had sunk into its familiar silence, Colette took a small piece of paper from her notebook and wrote a single line. "Your mother is trying to say something through the books." She folded the paper in half, walked down the East Wing hallway, stopped at the border of the West Wing, took a long breath, then crossed over. The walnut floor beneath her feet was cold, just as it had been that first night, but this time she wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was going. The library was dark. Cassian wasn't there, but the glass of whiskey sat on the desk, already poured, untouched, which meant he would return. Colette placed the note beneath the base of the glass, where he would certainly see it when he lifted the drink, then went back to her room and waited. She didn't have to wait long. At 11 o'clock that night, there was a knock on her door. 3 short taps, not repeated. She opened the door. Whelan stood in the hallway, his face expressionless. "Mr. Salvetti wants to see you, now." Colette nodded, took the sheet of notes she had prepared that afternoon, the one containing every underlined word, the book titles, the page numbers, and the order in which Constance had requested them, then followed Whelan through the dark hallway toward the West Wing. The library was lit now, the same desk lamp casting a round pool of light over the wooden surface that she had seen on that first night. Cassian sat behind the desk, her note opened before him, the glass of whiskey pushed aside. He didn't look up when she entered. Whelan closed the door from the outside, the soft sound of wood touching wood rising briefly before silence swallowed everything. Colette stood in the middle of the room for one heartbeat. She looked at the chair across from Cassian's desk, the dark brown leather chair, and she understood by instinct that if she stood, she was the one being questioned. But if she sat, she was the one bringing information. She stepped forward and sat down, without being invited, without asking permission. Cassian looked up. If he was surprised that she had seated herself, his face gave nothing away. He only looked at her, then down at the note. "Explain. One word. Just like the last time." Colette placed her sheet of notes on the desk and pushed it gently toward him. "Madame Constance asks me to read books in a very specific order. Never from the beginning. Always the exact chapter, the exact page. I thought it was only a habit of hers, until I checked the pages she requested and found pencil underlines on each one. Cassian didn't interrupt. He sat motionless, his eyes on the paper she had just handed him, and Colette continued. Each page has one underlined word. When they're put together in the exact order she asked me to read them, they form a message. I wrote everything down on that paper. Cassian lifted the sheet. She watched his eyes move from top to bottom, slowly, word by word. Brother, inside, port, Red Hook, Paxton, Brennan, betrayal, father same. He stopped at one word. Colette knew which one because she saw his fingers, the fingers holding the paper, tighten. Not sharply, not suddenly, only a small change in pressure that she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been looking straight at his hand. Paxton. He read his brother's name aloud, his voice so flat that it sounded like a word in a dictionary instead of a human being's name. The paper in his hand crumpled. Not much, just enough for Colette to see a new crease appear at the corner where his thumb pressed into it. Then he looked up. His eyes met hers, and this time Colette saw something different from that first night in the library. Not cold appraisal, not unease because she hadn't lowered her head, but something deeper, darker, something she would later recognize as an anger that had existed long before she came here, but that now had a name and a shape. Who knows about this besides you? No one. Are you sure? I haven't told anyone. Not Dolores? No. My mother? Madame Constance didn't tell me directly. She sent it through the books. I put it together myself. Silence stretched. Cassian set the paper down on the desk, smoothing the crumpled crease with his palm. Slowly, methodically, as though that physical action helped him put something back in order inside himself, something Colette wasn't allowed to see. Then he spoke, his voice returning to the state of perfect control she was beginning to understand was the mask he wore every day. From now on, you'll continue reading to my mother. Normally. Nothing changes. No one can know you spoke to me. Colette nodded. And every night, after 9 o'clock, you'll write down any word my mother sends through the books. Every word, every page, every volume. You'll bring it to me here. Colette nodded again, and as she did, she realized she had just crossed a line with no road back. 2 minutes ago, she had been a caregiver who read books. Now she was the secret line of communication between a blind mother trapped in her own room and her son, the head of an empire that his own brother was betraying. She stood, not waiting for permission, because she understood that the relationship between them had changed. Not equal, but no longer merely homeowner and hired help. He needed her, and in this world, being needed meant staying alive. She walked to the door, her hand touching the knob, when Cassian spoke again, his voice no louder than before, but carrying a different weight. Miss Varden, she turned back. If anyone in this house asks you about the books, about my mother, about anything you saw here tonight, you know nothing. I understand. Good, because if the wrong person knows before I do, he stopped, and that pause was more frightening than any threat he could have spoken. Then he finished, I won't be able to protect you. Colette stepped out, closed the door behind her, walked down the dark hallway toward the east wing, entered her room, and sat on the bed. She didn't tremble this time. She only sat very still and realized that Cassian's last words hadn't been a threat. They were a warning, and the most frightening part of that warning wasn't the part that said I won't be able to protect you. It was the word protect, because it implied that he intended to protect her, and Colette didn't know whether that made her feel safer or more afraid. 3 days after the meeting in the library, Colette was reading to Constance in the morning when she heard a car pull up outside, not the kind of sealed black car she had grown used to seeing parked at night near the west wing, but a silver sports car stopping right in front of the main entrance in broad daylight, its door opening with music cut off halfway, and confident footsteps crossing the white gravel. Constance sat still in her armchair, her head tilted slightly toward the window, listening to the footsteps coming closer. She didn't say the name, but her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hand tightened on the book just enough for Colette to notice. A few minutes later, the door to Constance's room opened, and a man stepped in without knocking. He was younger than Cassian, perhaps in his early 30s, with a face handsome in a pleasant, trustworthy way. A wide smile revealing white teeth, bright eyes, neatly combed brown hair, and a soft leather jacket draped loosely over his shoulders, as though he had just stepped out of a magazine instead of the car parked in front of a Mafia mansion. He walked straight to Constance and bent to kiss her forehead. "Mom, I'm home." Constance didn't lean into the kiss. She sat upright, her hand still holding the book, and said only one word. "Paxton." Her voice was flat, not warm, not cold, simply identifying him, like someone reading a name from a list. Paxton didn't seem bothered. He gave a light laugh, then turned to Colette, and his eyes swept from her face down to her feet and back up again with the speed of a man used to assessing women in a few seconds. "New caregiver?" he said, his voice friendly, relaxed, as though he were chatting in a cafe instead of standing in his mother's room. Much prettier than the last one. Colette kept a polite smile on her lips, even though her spine went cold, because she knew this name. She had pieced it together from the pages Constance had sent her. She had written it on the sheet of paper Cassian had crumpled in his hand 3 nights earlier, and now that name was standing in front of her in flesh and blood, smiling at her, not knowing what she knew. "Yes, I'm Colette." Paxton nodded, his eyes lingering on her longer than necessary. "My mother still makes you read those boring old books, huh?" He laughed, turning toward Constance with a teasing voice. "Mom, give the poor girl a break. Making her read Dostoevsky all the time is cruel." Constance didn't laugh. She only said, her voice still flat, "Books aren't boring. People who don't understand books are boring." Paxton shrugged, his smile never fading, then patted Colette lightly on the shoulder as he passed. Poor thing. Locked up with an old woman and a bunch of moldy books. He walked out of the room, his confident footsteps fading down the hallway, and Colette sat still with the book on her lap, keeping the smile on her lips until she was certain he was gone completely. Then she breathed out and realized she had been holding her breath from the moment he stepped in. Constance said nothing more throughout that morning's reading. She only asked Colette to continue, her voice normal, but her hand on the book didn't relax the way it usually did. That afternoon, when Colette left Constance's room to return to her own room and rest before the afternoon reading, Dolores was standing in the hallway, not waiting, or perhaps waiting while pretending it was a coincidence. She was rearranging the flowers in the vase on the small table in the corner, the same table Colette had bumped into on that first night. Dolores looked up as Colette passed, smiling the kind of smile Colette never trusted. "How was the morning reading?" "Normal. Madame Constance seems to like your voice. She asks to change books less often than before." Colette gave a slight nod, keeping her steps even. Then Dolores asked another question, her voice gentle, but Colette heard the sharp point hidden inside it. "What has she been asking you to read lately?" A simple question. Ordinary. But it wasn't ordinary, because Dolores had never specifically asked her what books Constance was reading before. And now, after Paxton had just arrived, she was asking, and Colette understood that this wasn't curiosity. It was information gathering. Gatsby, Crime and Punishment. A few chapters of Hemingway. She answered in the calmest voice she had. The things she always asks for. Dolores nodded, her eyes staying on Colette for another beat before returning to the flowers. "Good." Colette kept walking, didn't look back, and felt Dolores's gaze on her back the whole length of the hallway. That night, after bringing her notes to the library for Cassian as agreed, Colette returned to her room close to 11:30. She opened the door, stepped inside, turned on the desk lamp, and froze. Nothing was obviously wrong. The room was still neat. The bed was still smoothly made. The curtains were still drawn shut. But Colette had lived in small spaces long enough to know when someone had touched her things. The desk drawer, the one she always pushed all the way in, now stuck out about 1/2 centimeter. The notebook she kept on the desk, the one she always placed face down, was now facing up, open to a middle page she didn't remember opening. Colette stood in the middle of the room, her heart beating fast, her eyes moving over every detail. She hadn't written anything important in that notebook. She was careful enough to keep all the notes about the code in the pocket of the jacket she carried with her, but someone had come in here looking for something, and they either hadn't bothered to hide it, or they wanted her to know they had entered, and Colette wasn't sure which possibility was more frightening. She sat down on the bed, both hands resting on her lap, staring at the open notebook on the desk, and for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt that the line between safety and danger she had been walking was far thinner than she had imagined. The following night, Colette brought the notes to the library as agreed. 2 new words Constance had sent through the afternoon reading, Wednesday and 11, and when joined with the earlier sequence, they began to form something more specific. A place, a time. But Colette didn't analyze it further, because she had told herself that her job was to write it down and pass it on, not to understand. She knocked on the library door twice, 2 short taps as she had done on the previous nights, waited for the voice inside telling her to come in, then stepped through the heavy wooden door. But tonight was different. Cassian wasn't sitting behind the desk. The desk lamp was off. The whiskey glass rested on the tabletop but hadn't been filled. He was standing beside the large window at the far end of the room, his back turned to her, one hand tucked into his trouser pocket, his shoulders slightly lowered instead of straight as they usually were, and the moonlight slipping through the glass drew a silver edge along the side of his face as he looked down at the dark garden below. He didn't turn around when she entered. Colette stopped in the middle of the room, the note in her hand, uncertain whether she should set it on the desk and leave or wait. She placed the paper on the desk. Then she waited, because something in the way he stood held her there. Not power, not command, but weariness. The kind of weariness he had never shown in front of her, and perhaps hadn't meant to show tonight, though darkness allowed people to slip out of their masks more easily than light did. She had been ready to say, "I left the note on the desk," and returned to her room when Cassian spoke. His voice aimed toward the window, not toward her, but in the quiet room. Every word was clear. "Do you realize it? You read all those books to my mother. Do you realize what they have in common?" Colette hesitated. She had realized it long ago, but saying it aloud meant stepping into a place she had told herself she shouldn't enter. "They're all about betrayal," she said, her voice soft and careful. Cassian nodded slowly, still looking out into the darkness beyond the window. "Gatsby was betrayed by his dream," he said, his voice low and even, but carrying a different rhythm. Not the rhythm of a man giving orders, but the rhythm of someone following a thread through his own mind. Raskolnikov was betrayed by himself. Monte Cristo was betrayed by his closest friend. He paused. "And my father was betrayed by someone inside the house." Colette stood still. The air in the room changed, and she felt it as clearly as a shift in temperature. Something had been unfastened. Some door inside him had just opened a crack. Perhaps by accident. Perhaps because of the darkness. Perhaps because he had carried this for too long and tonight it was heavier than usual. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Colette saw that his face carried none of the expressions she had come to know. Not coldness, not control, not appraisal. It carried something she could only call weight, the kind of weight built up over many years of carrying something no one else was allowed to help carry. "My father died 8 years ago," he said. "Everyone said it was an accident. Then everyone said it was an enemy. Then no one said anything anymore, because no one dared to ask." He looked down at his own hand, the hand gripping the window frame, then released it. "But my mother knew. She always knew. And she waited 8 years to say it because she didn't trust anyone in this house enough to speak." Silence. Colette reached for the note on the desk and then realized she had already set it down, that her hands were empty, and she didn't know where to put them. So she only stood still and stayed quiet, because she understood by instinct that tonight Cassian didn't need her to say anything. He didn't need comfort, didn't need analysis, didn't need her to play advisor or ally. He only needed someone to stand there and listen, without judgment, without fear, without calculation. And Colette didn't know whether she had any right to be that person, but she didn't leave. She stood there, in the middle of the dark library, 4 steps away from him, and let him know that someone was listening. Cassian looked at her, not with appraisal, not with command, only looked like a man seeing something unexpected in a place where he hadn't expected to find it. Then he gave a slight nod, a nod Colette wasn't sure meant thank you or simply meant he knew she was there, but it was enough. She nodded back, softly, then turned and walked out. No more words, from either of them. She walked down the west wing hallway in the darkness, crossed the boundary into the east wing, returned to her room, closed the door, and leaned her back against the wood the way she had on the first night she met him in the library. But tonight, she didn't tremble. Tonight, she only stood against the door and realized that what had just happened in the library hadn't been a conversation. It had been a moment in which 2 people stood inside the same darkness, and neither one ran away. No one touched anyone. No one said anything unnecessary. But a boundary had shifted, fragile and irreversible. And Colette knew that when she entered the library tomorrow night carrying her notes, everything between her and Cassian Salvetti would no longer be the same as before. Not because of what had happened, But because of what had not happened, she had stayed when she could have left, and he had let her see what he didn't let anyone see, and they both knew it. Everything broke open within 48 hours. Later, when Colette looked back, she realized she should have seen it coming. The pieces had been scattered around her for days. Her room searched, Dolores probing about the books, Paxton's gaze lingering on her longer than necessary. But she had been too focused on the code and too accustomed to the constant unease inside the mansion to tell the difference between background danger and danger moving straight toward her. The first day began with the medicine. That morning, when Colette entered Constance's room with the tea tray as usual, Dolores was already there, standing beside Constance's medication table with her face hardened. "The medicine has been tampered with," Dolores said, her voice flat but loud enough for anyone passing through the hallway to hear. "The morning dose and the evening dose have been switched." Colette looked at the pill organizer. The 4 small compartments clearly marked morning, noon, afternoon, evening, and she knew with certainty that the night before, when she had left Constance's room, everything had been in the correct place because she had arranged it herself according to the doctor's instructions, just as she did every day. "I arranged it correctly last night," Colette said, her voice calm. Dolores didn't argue. She only looked at her, gave a slight nod, then said, "I'll make a note of that," and walked out. But the way she said, "I'll make a note of that," didn't sound like she was recording an explanation. It sounded like she was recording evidence. That afternoon, Constance's favorite precious book, a first edition of The Great Gatsby that Colette had held in her hands every day for nearly 3 weeks, was found with its spine torn and 3 pages crumpled. Dolores brought it to Colette, holding the book as though she were holding evidence from a crime scene. "You were the last person to read this." "I didn't tear it." Dolores nodded again. Again, the same sentence. "I'll make a note of that." On the second day, Constance's medication schedule was entirely wrong. The noon dose had been skipped, and the afternoon dose had been given 2 hours early. Colette knew she had followed the schedule correctly, because she recorded every time she gave medicine in the small notebook she kept with her. But when she took it out to prove it, Dolores looked at the handwritten lines and said, not cruelly but sharply, "A notebook you wrote yourself is something you control yourself. It doesn't prove anything." Colette began to understand. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. Someone was building a case against her, piece by piece, carefully, methodically, and each incident was designed to look like a caregiver's negligence instead of deliberate sabotage. But before she could react, everything moved into a stage she hadn't expected. On the afternoon of the second day, Paxton appeared at the mansion for the second time, this time without the charming smile, without patting anyone on the shoulder, but walking straight into the West Wing office and speaking to someone on the phone in a low voice that Colette only caught in passing as she moved down the hallway. An hour later, Paxton came out, met Dolores in the foyer, and spoke loudly enough for the 2 kitchen maids passing by to hear. "I want security checked throughout the entire mansion. Every room. No exceptions." "Routine security, sir? Or has something happened?" Dolores asked, her voice so perfect that if Colette hadn't known what she knew, she would have believed it was a real question. "Information has been leaked," Paxton said, his eyes moving along the hallway before stopping on Colette, who was standing 10 steps away. "I want to make sure no one in this house is working for the outside." 2 men Colette had never seen before followed Paxton and searched every room. The kitchen staff rooms, Dolores's room, Whelan's room, then Colette's room. She stood at the door and watched them pull open drawers, open her suitcase, check beneath the bed, check the jacket pockets hanging behind the door, and she kept her face normal because she had handed every note about the code to Cassian each night. She had kept nothing. Then, one of the 2 men opened the desk drawer, the same drawer Colette had seen shifted the night before, and pulled out a small black USB drive that Colette had never seen in her life. He held it up. The room fell silent. Paxton stepped forward, took the USB drive, and plugged it into the laptop the second man was carrying. The screen lit up, and from where she stood at the door, Colette saw lines of text and spreadsheets she didn't understand in detail but understood in nature. Lists, dates, port names, container numbers, shipping routes. The kind of information that, if it fell into an enemy's hands, would destroy the entire operation of the Salvetti family. Paxton turned to her. His face wasn't angry. It was sad, the kind of sadness carefully designed, and his voice carried exactly the right amount of disappointment when he said, You're a spy. The Brennan family planted you here. I don't know what that USB drive is, Colette said, her voice calm, though she could hear her heartbeat pounding at her temples. I've never seen it before. Paxton looked at her, slowly shook his head, then said to the two men, Take her down to the basement room. No one goes in or out until I speak with my brother. Colette took one step back, instinctively, but the two men were already standing on either side of her, and she understood that resisting in this house wasn't an option. She looked at Dolores, who stood in the hallway, hands clasped before her stomach, face expressionless, and in that moment their eyes met. Colette saw what she needed to see. Not remorse, not surprise, but the perfect emptiness of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen, because she was the one who had arranged it. They took Colette down to a small room in the basement, concrete walls, a single ceiling bulb, one chair, one steel door. The door closed, the lock turned, then silence. Colette sat on the only chair in the basement room, her back against the cold concrete wall, both hands resting on her lap, staring at the ceiling bulb that gave off a murky yellow light, never flickering, never going out, only glowing steadily, like an eye that never closed. She didn't know how long it had been since the steel door shut. There was no window, no clock, only 4 concrete walls, a cement floor, and a silence so thick she could hear her own heartbeat pulsing in her throat. She didn't cry. She didn't pound on the door. She didn't scream that she was innocent, because she understood that in this house, innocence wasn't a shield. It was only a word, and that word had no weight when the person accusing her was the boss's own younger brother. But then she thought of Bea, and everything she had managed to hold together from the moment they brought her down here began to crack. Bea was in Brooklyn. Mrs. Jenkins downstairs was taking her to school, but Mrs. Jenkins was 72 years old, with aching knees, and she had agreed to watch Bea because Colette paid her $100 a week from her caregiver salary. If Colette didn't come back, didn't call, didn't send money, Mrs. Jenkins wouldn't keep the child forever. Then what? Bea was 8 years old, the scar on her chest. No father, no mother. Her sister was the last person she had, and that sister was sitting in the basement of a Mafia mansion in Cold Spring, accused of being a spy, because of a USB drive she had never touched but that no one believed she hadn't planted. For the first time since stepping into this house, Colette truly panicked. Not the loud kind of panic, not screaming or beating the walls. It was the kind of panic that happened inside, when her chest tightened until she couldn't draw enough air, when her hands gripped her knees until her knuckles went white, when her mind repeated one sentence over and over. If I die here, Bea has no one. If I die here, Bea has no one. Then she remembered Nina Calloway, the caregiver before her, the woman who had sat in the chair in Constance's room, who had read those books, who had begun to recognize the code, and then vanished. Dolores had said she resigned. Cassian had never mentioned her, and Colette now understood that she was walking the exact same road Nina had walked, every step the same. And at the end of that road there wasn't an iron gate opening to the outside, but an ending no one would question. She forced herself to breathe. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Exhale for 4 counts. The technique she had taught her 3rd-grade children when they cried because they were afraid of a test. She taught children. She tied shoelaces and read Dr. Seuss. She didn't belong in this place. But she was here, and Bea needed her alive, so she would breathe. In the east wing of the mansion, 2 floors and half the house away from the basement room, Constance Salvetti sat in her armchair beside the window that had been closed because night had fallen, her ears, sharpened by 5 years of blindness more finely than any blade in this house, listening. She had heard everything. Not the words. The mansion was too large for that. But she heard the sounds, the rhythms, the changes, unfamiliar footsteps in the east wing hallway in the afternoon, heavier, more numerous than usual, the kind of footsteps made by people searching for something, the sound of Colette's door opening and closing several times, Paxton's voice, which she recognized at once because she had known her son's voice before he ever entered a room, since he was a boy. Then the sound of Colette's lighter footsteps caught between 2 heavier sets of footsteps, moving farther away, down the stairs, then gone. And after that, silence. The kind of silence Constance knew too well. The kind of silence that came after someone was taken away. She had heard it once before, 3 weeks before Colette arrived, the night Nina Calloway disappeared. Constance sat motionless for a long time, in the darkness of her blind eyes, her hands gripping the arms of the chair, and she felt the thing she had tried to bury during 3 years of isolation in the East Wing begin to rise. Not fear. Constance Salvetti had lived beside power and death for too long to still be afraid. What rose was something older, stronger. The thing she had once used to help command an entire empire when her husband was alive. The thing she had hidden behind blind eyes, and the still posture of a frail old woman for the past 3 years. Dignity, will, power that needed no sight. Whelan, she called his name. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence of the East Wing like a sword being drawn from its sheath. Whelan entered within a minute, which meant he had been nearby, which meant he had heard too. "Madam, what happened to the girl?" It wasn't a question. It was an order to answer. Whelan was silent for 1 beat, weighing loyalty to Cassian against obedience to the blind old woman he had served since before Cassian became boss. Then he said, "Mr. Paxton found a USB drive in her room. Shipping route information. She was taken down to the basement." Silence lasted a very long time, so long that Whelan thought she hadn't heard clearly and was about to repeat himself. Then Constance spoke, and her voice in that moment made Whelan, the man who had stood beside Cassian Salvetti in rooms where other men knelt, feel his spine straighten unconsciously. "Take me to my son. Right now." "Madam, it's late." "Right. Now." 2 words, each one a stone set down, no room for hesitation. Whelan nodded, though she couldn't see it, then stepped forward and pushed the wheelchair out of the room. Constance sat in the chair, her back perfectly straight, her hands resting on her lap, her blind eyes fixed straight ahead into a darkness that, to her, was no different from daylight. And as Whelan pushed her through the East Wing hallway, then across the boundary into the West Wing, through the dark walnut corridor, past the oil paintings she had never needed to see to know where they hung, what anyone who saw her then would have recognized was not a sick, blind old woman, isolated for 3 years, being wheeled through her own house. It was a queen returning. Whelan pushed Constance's wheelchair into the West Wing office where Cassian was sitting behind the desk, and when the door opened, Cassian looked up and stopped halfway through whatever he had been doing, because his mother hadn't crossed the boundary into the West Wing in 3 years. She hadn't left her room except for those afternoons in the garden. And now she was here, close to midnight, sitting upright in her wheelchair, her blind eyes aimed straight at him with a precision that needed no light. "Leave us to talk alone," Constance said to Whelan without turning her head. Whelan looked at Cassian. Cassian gave a slight nod. The door closed. Mother and son remained in the middle of the room, one seated behind the desk, one seated in a wheelchair, the desk lamp casting a round pool of light between them, and Constance spoke first, not waiting for her son to ask, because she had waited long enough. "Your father didn't die in an accident." Cassian didn't move. "Your father didn't die because of an enemy." Silence. "Your father died because of the very person you call your brother." Cassian sat motionless. His face didn't change, but his hand on the desk, the same hand Colette had once seen crumple the paper when he read Paxton's name, slowly closed into a fist now, controlled, restrained, but still a fist. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice so low and flat it was almost not a question. Constance drew a breath. "I suspected it for a long time, since before your father died. But suspicion isn't proof, and I had nothing except the feeling that something was wrong in the way Paxton spoke to people he shouldn't have been speaking to. Then I went blind." She paused, and in that pause there was something like a bitter laugh that never became sound. "And when I went blind, my ears opened. I heard things I had overlooked when I could still see. Paxton's late-night calls in his room in the West Wing. He thought the walls were thick and I was far away, but at night this mansion is so quiet I can hear mice running across the roof. And I heard him mention Brennan, heard him mention the port, heard him speak about your schedule in a voice a younger brother should not use when talking about his older brother. I began putting it together. It took 2 years. 2 years of sitting in that room, listening, remembering, because I couldn't write, I couldn't make calls, and I knew my room was bugged. Paxton had it done after I began asking too many questions about my husband's death." Cassian said, his voice still flat, but the fist on the desk tightening harder. "Why didn't you tell me?" Constance turned her head toward him, and though she couldn't see him, her blind gaze found the exact place where his face was. "Because you haven't listened to me since the day your father died. The sentence fell into the room like a stone dropped into deep water. You built walls, Constance continued, her voice not trembling, not rising, but every word carrying the weight of 8 years of silence. You closed every door. You became the man the world feared. And I understood why. I understood that you needed to become that man to hold together everything your father left behind. But while you were building walls to keep your enemies outside, you locked me outside too. The world feared you, but I lost you. Cassian said nothing. He sat behind the desk, his fist on the wood, his eyes on his mother, and Colette wasn't there to see it. But Whelan, standing outside the door, heard the silence stretch, the kind of silence so heavy it had shape, and he knew something was breaking open inside that room. Not breaking like ruin, but breaking like thawing ice. Slow, painful, and necessary. So I sent it through the books, Constance went on. I guided Nina's hand in silence, pressing her fingers onto the words I remembered by heart until she understood what to mark. Nina was brave. She realized the pattern and continued the work in secret. Then Paxton found out. She stopped. Nina didn't resign. The sentence was simple, but it carried the death of a human being no one in this house had asked about. Then that girl came, Constance said, and her voice changed, softened, carrying something Cassian hadn't heard in his mother's voice for a very long time. Tenderness. She isn't one of us. She's a teacher. She reads Dr. Seuss to children and ties her little sister's shoes. She doesn't understand this world, but she listens. She sees. And she brought the message to you even though she knew it could cost her life. And now you've allowed your brother to lock her in the basement. Cassian looked down at his fist on the desk. Slowly, he opened it, his fingers loosening one by one, and Colette would never know what that moment looked like. But Whelan knew because he heard Cassian speak. His voice no longer flat, no longer perfectly controlled, with only one word left in it. Mother. Then silence. Then the sound of the chair shifting against the floor. Then footsteps. And Whelan knew without seeing it that Cassian Salvetti, the man the entire East Coast feared, had just stepped to his mother's wheelchair and placed his hand over hers. For the first time in many years, Constance said nothing. She only turned her hand over, opened her palm, and held her son's hand. 20 minutes later, the basement room door opened. Colette looked up from the chair where she had been sitting with her knees drawn in for she didn't know how long. Her eyes red but dry because she hadn't cried. And she saw Cassian standing in the doorway. Alone. No Whelan, no Paxton, no guards. Only him. You're not a spy, he said. His voice was different. She didn't know how else to explain it. But it was different. As though something had been taken apart or set down, and he hadn't had time to put it back into place. Colette stood, her legs numb from sitting too long, and looked at him. The USB drive wasn't mine. I know. Silence. Then he asked. And this question was not the question of a mafia boss asking a caregiver. It was the question of one human being asking another. You knew the danger. You knew the woman before you disappeared. Why did you still bring the message to me? Colette looked at him, and she answered with the only truth she had. Because she saw me more clearly than anyone I've ever met. And because I know what it feels like to want to say something, but have no one willing to listen. Cassian looked at her, for a long time, not judging, not analyzing, only looking. Then he stepped aside, giving her a path through the doorway. A small gesture, wordless, but it said more than any sentence he had ever spoken to her. Because it was not opening a door for a prisoner, it was opening a door for someone he trusted. Colette stepped past him, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cold hallway. And she walked toward the east wing, her steps even, without looking back, but she knew he was standing there watching her leave. And she knew that the moment in the basement room, when he opened the door and stepped aside, had changed everything between them in a way that couldn't be named, but also couldn't be undone. Cassian didn't act immediately. He waited. The next morning, he sat at breakfast with Paxton in the West Wing dining room, as though nothing had happened. Poured coffee for his younger brother, asked about that week's shipping route, nodded when Paxton reported numbers that both of them knew only one of them was telling the truth about. Colette was moved from the basement to a small room at the end of the east wing, the door locked from the outside, Whelan standing guard, and as far as Paxton knew, she was waiting to be dealt with, because that was the word Paxton used when he spoke about people who knew too much. Dealt with, neatly, cleanly, as though a human being could be cleaned away like a stain on the floor. Cassian let Paxton believe that. He let Paxton feel comfortable. He even let Paxton suggest, on his own, that he oversee the shipment at the Red Hook port on Wednesday night. The shipment Paxton had planned in advance, the shipment that was actually a secret meeting with Orla Brennan's people, and Cassian only had to nod and say, "Good, I trust you," then turn back to his coffee. 3 days. Cassian waited 3 days, and during those 3 days, he behaved with a flawless normality that only someone who had spent his entire life among people who wanted to kill him could maintain, the kind of normality in which every smile, every nod, every ordinary sentence was calculated down to the millisecond. On Wednesday night, at 11 o'clock, Paxton drove to the Red Hook container port in Brooklyn. The port at night was a maze of steel and darkness, hundreds of containers stacked like giant blocks, murky yellow sodium lights shining over pavement wet with mist, the distant engine rumble of cargo ships out in the bay, and silence in between, the kind of silence chosen by transactions that didn't want anyone to know they existed. Paxton parked near Pier 4, the place he had arranged in advance. 2 men were already waiting beside a black SUV, one of them a close operative of Orla Brennan, the man Paxton had been in contact with for more than a year. They shook hands. Paxton opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents: updated shipping route maps, guard rotation schedules, port warehouse access codes, everything Brennan needed to seize control of the Salvetti transport network in a single night. They talked. Paxton spoke about timing. Next week, when Cassian would be attending a meeting on Arthur Avenue, when the security team would be thinnest, when everything would happen quickly and cleanly. He said the word cleanly the same way he had spoken about Colette, dealt with. Then the lights came on. Not the sodium lights of the port, headlights, 4 vehicles at once, switching on from 4 directions, aimed straight at Pier 4, turning the darkness into white glare so bright that Paxton lifted a hand to shield his eyes and took 1 step back. Brennan's man reached toward his waistband, but before he could touch it, footsteps sounded from every direction. Many men, moving fast, organized, surrounding Pier 4 in no more than 15 seconds. Whelan stood in the inner circle, and beside him were 5 men Paxton recognized at once because he had sat at the same table with them before. Cassian's most loyal guards, the men Paxton had tried to buy, though not one of them had wavered. Brennan's 2 men were disarmed and forced to the ground before they could say a word. Paxton stood in the middle of the circle, the document still in his hand, and he turned his head, searching for an exit. But there was no exit, only blinding white headlights and the shadows of men standing all around him. Then the darkness behind the 4th car separated, and Cassian stepped out. He wasn't in a hurry. His steps were even, his hand in his coat pocket, his face so calm that if anyone had seen him then, without knowing the context, they would have thought he was taking a night walk. He stopped 3 steps from Paxton. The brothers looked at each other. Paxton opened his mouth, and Colette would never later know what he had meant to say, because Cassian spoke first. His voice low, even, not angry, not sad, carrying only the certainty of someone who had known the answer long before asking the question. "Did you think you were better than Father?" Paxton stood still. "Father didn't see you coming either," Cassian continued. "But Mother." He stopped. Mother always saw, and Colette would later need no one to tell her that the moment Paxton heard the word Mother was the moment he truly collapsed. Not because he had been caught, not because his plan had failed, but because he realized that the blind old woman he had looked down on for years, the mother sitting quietly in her armchair in the East Wing, the woman he thought knew nothing anymore except Earl Grey tea and old books, was the very one who had destroyed him, not with power, not with violence, but with the ears and patience of a mother who had never stopped protecting her child, even though that child hadn't listened to her for 8 years. Dolores was brought to the mansion the next morning. She sat before Cassian in the office, with camera evidence from the port and recordings from the listening device Paxton himself had installed in Constance's room placed on the desk, and Dolores confessed through tears that Paxton had threatened to kill her son, the 25-year-old living in New Jersey whom she had raised alone, if she didn't cooperate. She had planted the USB drive in Colette's room. She had tampered with the medicine. She had torn the book. Cassian listened in silence, then said, "You served this family for 25 years. You'll leave tonight. Your son will be safe. But if I see your face again, my patience will end." Dolores left the mansion before sunset, her suitcase dragging over the white gravel, without looking back. Paxton was taken away before dawn that morning, in the sealed black car whose engine Colette heard at 4 o'clock in the morning from her room in the East Wing. She lay in bed, eyes open, listening as the car faded down the gravel drive and disappeared beyond the iron gate. She didn't ask Cassian where he had been taken. That morning, when she met him in the hallway, she looked at him, and he looked back, and both of them knew there were questions whose answers would change her forever. So she didn't ask, and he didn't speak. And that silence between them wasn't concealment, but protection. He was protecting her from his world, and she let him. 1 week after Paxton disappeared, when Colette began to think the worst part had passed, and the mansion was slowly returning to the quiet rhythm she had grown used to, the envelope appeared. It was lying on the reception table in the foyer, white, with no stamp, no return address, only her name written in block letters, Colette Varden. And Colette knew the moment she saw it that something was deeply wrong, because no one sent mail to the caregiver in this mansion. She didn't exist on paper here. She didn't have a mailing address in Cold Spring, and someone had to know she was here, know her name, and find a way to get this envelope past the iron gate and all the way inside the house. She opened it right there in the foyer, her hand steady until she pulled out what was inside, and everything stopped. Photographs. 3 of them. Printed in color. Clear. Bea walking on the sidewalk near her school in Brooklyn, the small backpack with the star keychain on her shoulder, the old sneakers Colette recognized at once, photographed from across the street, from an angle, the kind of angle taken by someone sitting in a car and shooting through glass. The second picture was Bea standing in front of the school gate, turning her head and smiling at someone, the scar on her chest not visible, though Colette knew it was there. She always knew it was there. The third picture was Bea walking into the studio building in Bushwick, alone, without Mrs. Jenkins beside her. Beneath the last photograph was one handwritten line, the handwriting neat and careful, as though the person writing it wasn't in a hurry, wasn't angry, only wanted to make sure every word was clear. So beautiful. Hope she's healthy. Colette didn't remember whether she ran or walked from the foyer to the West Wing. She only remembered the door to Cassian's office opening. Maybe she pushed it. Maybe she struck it. She didn't know. And she stood in front of his desk, threw the envelope down onto the wood, the photographs sliding out, all 3 of them, and she said, or thought she said, because her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like the voice of someone drowning, trying to call out before the water swallowed her. They know about Bea. They know my sister's school. Cassian looked down at the photographs. His hand picked up the first one, then the second, then the third, then read the line beneath it. His face changed, and Colette had seen many expressions on that face. Coldness, control, exhaustion, unease. But she had never seen this. It wasn't anger. Anger was something he could control. He had controlled it all his life. What appeared on his face then was more primal, older. It was the instinct to protect. The kind of instinct he perhaps hadn't known he had until he saw photographs of an 8-year-old child with a scar on her chest being secretly followed on her way to school. He picked up the phone. "Whelan, bring the child to the mansion. Right now. No one touches her." He didn't ask Colette where the child was, because he already knew from the background check. Bushwick, 4th floor, Mrs. Jenkins downstairs. The public school 2 blocks away. He knew everything, and he hadn't used that information until now, when it had become the difference between safety and a loss Colette couldn't survive. Colette stood in the middle of the room, her hands hanging at her sides, and she didn't know what to do because she was used to handling everything by herself. Used to running alone from one hospital to another with her sister in her arms, used to counting money alone in the metal box under the bed, used to facing everything alone, and now someone else was handling it for her, and she didn't know where to put her hands. Cassian looked at her. "Sit down," he said, his voice not an order this time, but closer to a request. "Wait here." She sat, and she waited. Whelan drove fast. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, close to 11 o'clock at night, the black car pulled up in front of the main entrance. Colette heard the gravel and ran out, and when the car door opened, Whelan stepped down with Bea in his arms, the child deeply asleep, her head resting against his shoulder, her little backpack dangling from one hand, and Whelan carried her so gently that Colette realized this was not the first time he had carried a child, though she didn't know what story lay behind that. Colette took Bea from Whelan's arms, held her against her chest, felt the child's even breathing against her neck, felt the warm weight of that small body in her hands, and she cried. For the first time since setting foot in this mansion, She truly cried, not silent crying, not stinging tears at the corners of her eyes, but crying so hard her shoulders shook, so hard she had to hold Bee tighter to keep herself from collapsing, and she cried in front of Cassian, who stood at the main door with his back against the frame, hands in his pockets. And he didn't look away, didn't say something useless like everything would be all right. He only stood there, between her and the door, between her and the darkness outside, between her and the entire world that wanted to touch the most precious thing in her life. And he stood there like a wall that this time she wasn't afraid of, a wall she was grateful for. When Bee had been laid down on the bed in Colette's room, still sleeping deeply and knowing nothing, Colette stood in the doorway and saw Cassian walking down the hallway toward the west wing, black coat on, steps even. He stopped when he reached her, without turning his head. "I'm going out tonight." Colette understood he wasn't talking about a business trip. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse. Cassian was silent for one beat. "Don't thank me for that." Colette looked at him. "For what?" "For anything I do in the dark." He walked away. Colette watched his shadow disappear at the end of the hallway, listened to his footsteps fading, then the door, then the car, then silence. He returned at dawn. Colette knew because she didn't sleep. She lay beside Bia and heard the car pass over the gravel as the sky was just beginning to brighten, heard the door, heard footsteps heavier than usual in the west wing hallway. She didn't ask where he had gone that night. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask because she had chosen. Not chosen not to know, but chosen to accept that this man existed in two worlds. One world where he left a book on the library desk and sat quietly watching a child draw pictures in the garden, and another world where he left the house at midnight and returned at dawn with Whelan carrying blood on his cuff that she pretended not to see. She accepted both, because he had protected Bee, and in Colette's world, that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, the mansion was quiet in a way Colette had never felt since arriving there. Not the heavy kind of silence that concealed secrets, but the silence of a house breathing again after a long storm. Dolores was no longer here. Paxton was no longer here. The listening device in Constance's room had been removed, and for the first time in 3 years, the door to Constance's room opened, not because of duty, but because of choice. Colette still read to Constance every day, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, but now there was no code, no underlined words, no hidden message between the pages. There were only books, only two women sitting beside each other in a room, scented with dried lavender and Earl Grey tea, one reading, one listening, and between them was something Colette couldn't find the exact word for, but the closest word was family. Constance began telling her about her youth, about the years before the Salvetti family swallowed her life, about the dream of becoming a teacher that she had set aside when she met Cassian's father. "You know," she said one afternoon, "I wanted to teach literature. Then I met him, and life turned in another direction, but I never stopped reading." Colette smiled softly and said, "You're still teaching. You teach me every day." One evening, a few days after everything settled, Colette stepped into the West Wing library to bring notes out of old habit, even though there were no notes left to bring. It was only that she still came, and he was still there, and neither of them spoke about it, but both of them understood that the library at 11 o'clock at night had become something that belonged to them. On the desk, beside the familiar glass of whiskey, there was a book she had never seen before, East of Eden, by John Steinbeck. She opened the first page. Written by hand in black ink, the letters neat and clear, were 2 words, Timshel, thou mayest. She knew this passage, the chapter around which the whole book turned, the passage where the character discovers that the Hebrew word Timshel does not mean thou shalt or thou must, but thou mayest, that human beings always have the right to choose, that no one is forced to become anything. Colette stood in the dark library, holding the book, reading the 2 handwritten words again and again, and she understood that this was not a gift. This was a message Cassian had sent to her, and to himself. The next day, she met him in the hallway, between the boundary of the East Wing and the West Wing, where the pale oak floor changed into dark walnut, and she said, without looking down, without hesitation, "I like Steinbeck." Cassian stopped walking. "Why?" "Because he believes people can change, no matter what world they live in." They stood there, in the dark hallway, with no one watching and no one listening, and Cassian looked at her with the gaze she had seen slowly take shape over the past weeks, from cold assessment to unease, from unease to curiosity, from curiosity to something he didn't name and she didn't dare name. But it was there, between them, in the distance of 4 steps on the wooden floor, and they both knew it. That weekend, Bea drew pictures in the garden. Cassian passed by, intending to keep walking, but Bea looked up and called, "Sir, do you want to see Bea's drawing?" And he stopped. The little girl held up the picture. 4 stick figures standing in front of a big house, with trees, with the sun, and 4 names scrawled in crayon beneath each stick figure. Letty, Grandma Constance, Bea, and Mr. Cassian. He looked at the picture. "Where did you draw me standing?" he asked. "At the door," Bea said, her voice matter of fact, as if everyone should know that. "Because you're the one who opens the door for everyone to come in." Cassian sat down beside her on the stone bench in the garden. He said nothing. He only sat there for 10 minutes, watching her add clouds and birds, and Colette stood at the upstairs window looking down, one hand resting on her chest, thinking that this was the moment she would remember longer than all the other moments in this house. The coldest Mafia boss on the East Coast, sitting quietly beside an 8-year-old girl in the garden, looking at a stick figure drawing. 6 months later, Colette was no longer a caregiver. She managed an education charity that Cassian had founded, one that provided books and scholarships for children in neighborhoods like Bushwick and East New York, places where she had once lived, places where elementary school teachers whose contracts had been cut and little girls with scars on their chests did not always have someone running to find hospital money for them. Bea went to a new school, a better school, closer to the mansion, and she called Constance Grandma, a word Constance heard for the first time, and then stayed silent for a long while before saying, her voice slightly hoarse, "Yes, Grandma is here." Constance grew weaker, her diabetes progressing, but she was peaceful in a way Colette had never seen before. One afternoon, after Colette finished reading a chapter and closed the book, Constance said, her voice light and slow, "I chose the right person." Colette asked, "For the books? For my son?" "Night. The library." Cassian sat reading. Colette stepped in, placed a cup of coffee beside him, a new habit in place of the whiskey he now drank far less often, then sat down in the leather chair across from him and opened her own book. No one said anything. Just 2 people in a room full of books, quiet, existing together, and the distance between the 2 chairs was no longer the distance between a Mafia boss and a caregiver, but the distance between 2 people who had chosen each other, even though no one in the world understood why. Then Cassian spoke, his eyes still on the page. "Do you know the first book my mother asked you to read? The Great Gatsby. Gatsby died because he trusted the wrong person." He turned the page, slowly. "I nearly died because I trusted no one." He looked up at her. "Then you walked into this house with bare feet and a glass of water." Colette laughed. A small laugh, real and warm. "I was wearing slippers, and Cassian Salvetti, the man the entire East Coast feared, the man who had sat in the dark, night after night with a glass of whiskey, and the weight of an empire betrayed by his brother and a murdered father, the man who had built walls around himself so high that even his own mother could not reach him. That man laughed, truly laughed, and Colette looked at that smile, rare, brief, and knew she would remember it forever. Colette had once thought books were only books, words on paper, other people's stories. But in this house, books had saved a blind mother when she had no other way to speak the truth. Books had exposed a traitor when power and money had blinded everyone else. And books had led an unemployed teacher from Bushwick to the man she had never thought she would love. Every page she read for that blind woman was a code. But the greatest code was not in the words. It was in the truth that sometimes the people who cannot see anything are the ones who see most clearly, and sometimes the people who have nothing are the ones who give the most. This story reminds us that kindness is not always repaid right away. Sometimes it leads you into the darkest places before it brings you into the light. It reminds us that the truth always finds a way out, no matter how deeply it is buried, through a book, through a pencil mark on a page, through a blind old woman, patiently waiting for the right person to come and listen. It reminds us that family is not always blood. Sometimes it is a stranger who steps into your life and chooses to stay, even after seeing every darkness you carry. If this story touched you, please press the like button, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear more stories like this every day. We would love to know how you feel after hearing Colette and Cassian's story. In real life, Have you ever met someone who saw the real you when the whole world looked past you? Please share your story in the comments. We read every line and cherish every word from the depths of your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.